Welcome! Today, we're going to unpack one of the most incredible origin stories in all of history. It's about how a single company, started for profit, ended up paving the way for a massive empire. So let's just dive right into the big question, right? How did this happen? How did a small group of merchants who were, believe it or not, actually pretty reluctant to acquire territory at first, end up ruling the entire Indian subcontinent?
We're going to break this wild transformation down into 4 key stages. And we'll start with the unique situation in India that basically opened the door for everything that followed.
Okay, so to really get this, we've got to set the scene. Let's travel back to the 18th century in India. It was a time of huge change. For centuries, the Mughals were the dominant force. I mean, they were it. But after the death of their last really powerful ruler, Aurangzeb, the whole thing started to wobble. The empire's central authority just began to crumble, and that created this massive power vacuum. All these regional governors and landlords who once answered to the emperor, well, they started to assert their own authority, carving out their own independent kingdoms. And this timeline just lays it all out, doesn't it? It shows this long, slow power vacuum developing. With Delhi no longer being an effective center of control, the stage was totally set for some new power to rise up and fill that void. So, you've got this power vacuum brewing in India. Now let's jump over and see how the British enter the picture. You know, their goal wasn't conquest, not at first. It was something way simpler: money. Our story really kicks off right here, in the year 1600. This is the moment the East India Company gets its hands on a really critical document from the ruler of England, Queen Elizabeth I. This thing was called a royal charter, and wow, it was basically a golden ticket. It created a monopoly. That means no other trading group in England could legally compete with them. It gave them this massive state-sanctioned advantage right from the get-go. Now, this is really the heart of their business model. They were a mercantile company. The whole strategy was to shut out the competition. The plan was dead simple: buy goods cheap in the East and then sell them for a much higher price back in Europe. And just look at the stuff they were after. We're not talking about everyday items here. Fine Indian cottons and silks were in huge demand back in Europe. And the spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, you couldn't get enough of them. These things could fetch absolutely enormous prices, promising incredible profit. But there was one huge flaw in the company's master plan. See, that royal charter from the Queen could stop other English companies from competing, sure, but it couldn't stop anyone else. And that was the problem in a nutshell. The English were not alone, not by a long shot. Other European powers had the exact same idea, and they were already on their way to the East. So the Eastern markets were getting incredibly crowded. As you can see, it wasn't just the English. By the time their first ships showed up, the Portuguese were already there. And pretty soon, the Dutch and the French arrived on the scene too. Suddenly, you have this 4-way rivalry for the exact same valuable goods. This kicked off a simple but really dangerous economic chain reaction. You've got all these companies trying to buy the same limited supply of spices and textiles. So what happens? The prices they have to pay in India shoot up. And higher costs mean lower profits when they sell back in Europe. It didn't take long to figure out that the only way to make the kind of money they dreamed of was to get rid of the competition. So the key takeaway here is that this wasn't some friendly competition, not at all. This need to secure markets led to fierce, violent battles between these trading companies. I mean, they would regularly sink each other's ships, blockade trade routes, and physically stop their rivals from getting supplies. This was basically trade as warfare. And all of this violence completely changed what the East India Company was. They couldn't just be merchants anymore. They had to become something else, something more. This slide just captures that shift perfectly. The company's main goal was still profit, yeah, but the tools to get that profit, they weren't just ships and goods anymore. Now they needed forts and weapons. The goal was slowly shifting towards control. So to protect their ships, their warehouses, and all those valuable goods from both their European rivals and local conflicts, the company started building fortified trading posts. They were, in effect, militarizing their own business operations. And this quote from our source really says it all, doesn't it? The lines had just completely blurred. To make money from trade, the company had to get involved in local conflicts and build up their defenses. Commerce and politics were now the exact same thing. Which leaves us with this final thought. The company's relentless hunt for profit had forced it to build forts, raise armies, and get deep into politics. It had transformed from a simple trading company into a real territorial power. And that set the stage for the dawn of an empire.
Today, we're diving into a fascinating story of transformation. It's about how a group of English merchants, the East India Company, started out as a simple trading venture, but ended up becoming a massive territorial power in India. So, let's get right into it. So, here's the million-dollar question, right? How does a company, a business focused on making a profit, eventually end up governing an entire subcontinent? Well, the seeds of that unbelievable change were all planted in one place, Bengal, which was one of the richest provinces of the Mughal Empire at the time. Our story really kicks off right here, in Bengal, way back in 1651. This is when the very first English factory was set up on the banks of the river Hooghly. Now, when I say factory, don't picture smokestacks and assembly lines. Think of it more like a base of operations, a central trading post. And the people who actually worked out of this factory, they were called factors. That was just the term for the company's traders. So the factory itself had a warehouse to store all the goods they were going to export, and it had offices where these factors, the company officials, did all their business. What's really wild is just how fast things escalated from here. I mean, look at this timeline. In 1651, you've just got a trading post, but as business boomed, the company started telling other merchants, hey, come settle near us. By 1696, they're not just trading anymore, they're building a whole fort. And just 2 years after that, they actually get landlord rights over 3 villages, one of which would grow into the city of Calcutta. You see what's happening? A simple trading post was morphing into actual territory. So, how did they pull this off? How did they expand so fast? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle was a special privilege they got their hands on, one that would become a massive source of conflict down the line. The company managed to convince the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb to issue something called a farman. Think of a farman as a royal order, an edict that had the full power of the empire behind it. And this specific farman gave the company an incredible advantage: the right to trade completely duty-free. No taxes at all. But here is where it all started to go wrong. This firman was only supposed to apply to the company's official trade. The problem was, a lot of those factors, the company officials, were running their own little side hustles. They had their own private businesses, and they started using the company's duty-free pass for their personal trade, refusing to pay any taxes on it. And the result for Bengal? A huge, enormous loss of revenue. As you can imagine, the local rulers of Bengal were not about to just sit back and watch this happen. After Emperor Aurangzeb died, the Nawabs of Bengal really started to flex their own power and autonomy, and they had a major bone to pick with the company. And these were not weak leaders. We're talking about a line of really powerful, assertive Nawabs, from Murshid Quli Khan to Ali Vardi Khan, and then finally to Siraj Ad-Daula. Every single one of them could see the threat the company posed, both to their power and to their wallet. So they started to push back, and they pushed back hard. They shut down any more concessions and started demanding huge payments, or tributes, just for the right to trade. They also tried to check the company's growing power by saying no to letting them mint their own coins, and this is a big one, ordering them to stop building any more forts. Basically, they called them out and accused the company of being deceitful. And this quote right here, it just perfectly sums up the problem from the Nawab's point of view. It wasn't just about the money, you see. The company's actions were seen as a direct challenge to their rule, something that was chipping away at their very authority as the leaders of Bengal. This kind of tension just couldn't last. The arguments over money and the clashes over who's really in charge, it all started to boil over into a direct confrontation. It became a war of words, where neither side was even remotely willing to back down. This comparison really shows the total breakdown. On one side, you have the Nawab saying, "You're refusing to pay taxes, you're writing disrespectful letters." And on the other, the company is saying, "Your unjust demands are killing our business. The only way for trade to work is if we pay no duties." They even argued they had to build more forts just to expand their trade. The two sides weren't just disagreeing. It was like they were speaking completely different languages. So, the key takeaway here is that this wasn't some simple misunderstanding. It was a deep, fundamental conflict of interest. You had a sovereign power on one side and a commercial company that was starting to act a lot like one on the other. These clashes were always going to lead to something bigger, and they eventually did, culminating in one of the most famous events in Indian history, the Battle of Plassey. And that kind of leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. When you look back at this whole story, from a tiny trading post to a fortified power that was challenging the local ruler, you have to wonder, when a commercial business gets that much power and influence, is a clash with the state pretty much inevitable? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining us.
Have you ever stopped to think about how a company, not an army or a government, could end up conquering an entire country? Well, today, that's exactly what we're digging into. We're talking about the wild story of the East India Company, a bunch of merchants who went from trading spices to ruling one of the richest places on the planet. It really sounds like something out of a movie, doesn't it? A private corporation taking over a whole nation. But it's exactly what happened. So the big question is, how did they pull it off? How did a business execute one of the most incredible takeovers in history? Let's get into it. All right, so let's set the scene. We're in the middle of the 18th century in the ridiculously wealthy province of Bengal. And this is where the East India Company's goals started to shift from just making money to actually wanting political power. So a new ruler, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, comes to power in Bengal, and the company gets nervous. See, they weren't really interested in a strong, independent leader. What they wanted was a puppet, someone they could control, who'd just give them a thumbs up on all their demands for trade deals. But Siraj-ud-Dowlah was nobody's puppet. He was, in fact, furious. And he laid down the law with 3 very clear demands. He basically told them, 1, stop messing around in our politics, 2, tear down your forts, and 3, you need to start paying taxes just like everybody else. The line in the sand had been drawn. So with negotiations totally broken down, the stage was set for a big confrontation. But this wasn't going to be just any battle. Oh no, this was a turning point that would literally decide the fate of India. And things escalated fast. The company just flat out refused the Nawab's demands. So Siraj-ud-Dowlah marches 30,000 soldiers and takes over their main base in Calcutta. The company's response? They sent in an army led by the very ambitious Robert Clive. War was officially on. The year is 1757. Now, this isn't just a random date. It's the exact moment the future of India completely changed course. What happened right here, at a place called Plassey, would have consequences for the next 200 years. You know, we tend to picture this huge, dramatic clash of armies. But the real story of the Battle of Plassey is way more interesting than that. The winner was decided long before the first shot was even fired. It was won with a secret backroom deal. Here's what happened. Robert Clive had made a secret pact with one of Siraj-ud-Dowlah's most important commanders, a guy named Mir Jafar. The deal was simple. You betray your leader, and we'll make you the new ruler. So when the battle started, Mir Jafar and his huge chunk of the army, they just stood there. They didn't fight. The Nawab's defeat was guaranteed. And that's why Plassey is so famous. It wasn't just another win. It was the company's first major victory in India. It sent a message to everyone. This trading company was now a serious military and political force to be reckoned with. And hey, here's a cool little fact for you. The name Plassey is actually just how the British pronounced Palashi. It's named for the local palash tree, which has these amazing red flowers that are used to make the colorful powder for the festival of Holi. Okay, so after their big win, the company tried a new tactic, ruling from the shadows. But, as they were about to find out, pulling the strings on puppets is a lot harder than it looks. You have to remember, at this point, the company still thought of itself as a business, not a government. Their main goal was to expand trade, not deal with the headaches of actually running a country. So, they kept their promise and put their guy, Mir Jafar, on the throne. But this whole strategy quickly turned into a complete farce. I mean, even a puppet ruler has to look like he's in charge, right? So when Mir Jafar started pushing back against the company's endless demands, they just kicked him out and put in his son-in-law, Mir Qasim. Then when Mir Qasim complained, they beat him in a battle and put Mir Jafar out. It was just this chaotic, revolving door of rulers. This crazy cycle just couldn't last. And it was pushing the company to make its biggest, most ambitious move yet, to stop pulling the strings and just take over completely. The company was just fed up. The whole puppet system was a disaster, and they needed a ton of money to pay for their wars and all their other expenses. Their patience had officially run out. And then you get this incredible, brutally honest quote from Robert Clive himself in 1765. "We must indeed become Nawabs ourselves. No more games, no more puppets.
It was time for the company to become the rulers. And that very same year, they made it happen. The Mughal emperor, who was still technically the top ruler in India, was pressured into naming the company the Diwan of Bengal. So on paper, it looked less like a conquest and more like a legal official job appointment. So what does being the Diwan actually mean? Well, it was the jackpot. It gave the company the right to collect all the taxes and run the government for the entire super rich region of Bengal. Basically, they now controlled all the money. And getting the Diwani, as it was called, set off a financial revolution. This is what completed the company's journey from a simple trading group to a full-blown territorial power. This switch was a total game changer. Think about it. Before 1765, the company had to bring ships full of gold and silver all the way from Britain to buy Indian products. But after they became Diwan, they just used the tax money they collected from Bengal to buy those very same products. The result was massive. The flow of gold and silver out of Britain didn't just slow down, it stopped completely. The company's whole operation in India was now paying for itself. Suddenly, the tax money from Bengal was paying for everything. It paid for the cotton and silk they were shipping out, it paid for their soldiers, it paid for building their forts and their offices. It became this perfectly self-sustaining machine for generating profit and power. So you go from a few ships of merchants to the actual rulers of a country. The story of the East India Company is just incredible and, frankly, a little terrifying. And it leaves us with a really big question, even for today. What happens when a company's goals become more important than the goals of a nation?
Okay, picture this. You're a British official in 18th century India, and suddenly you have access to a kind of wealth that's almost impossible to imagine. The men who lived this reality became known as nabobs. Their story is one of incredible power, staggering ambition, and the true cost of empire. Let's get right into it.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First up, we'll meet these new nawabs. Then, we'll see how the East India Company went from just traders to full-on rulers. After that, we'll zoom in on the most famous nabob of them all, a guy named Robert Clive. Then we'll explore the very different fates of these men. And finally, we'll see what happened when they tried to bring all that money back home to Britain. All right, so our story really kicks off with this massive shift in India. You see, the British East India Company wasn't just there to trade spices anymore. Nope. It was gaining some serious power, and the guys working for it started to get some very, very big ideas.
And they even got a nickname for themselves, nabobs. Now, this is basically a British mispronunciation of the Indian word nawab, which means a local prince or ruler. And that tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it? These company men started seeing themselves as exactly that, powerful, wealthy rulers.
This became really personal, really fast. It wasn't just about making the company rich anymore. The guys on the ground looked at the actual Indian nawabs with their incredible wealth and status, and they started to dream. They had visions of living that exact same life. So you're probably wondering, how on earth did this happen so quickly? I mean, how did a trading company get this powerful? Well, you have to understand. When they first showed up, they were anything but powerful. They were actually pretty modest. Just listen to the actual Nawab of Bengal talking about the English back in 1733. He said they came to him and petitioned in a humble manner, just asking for a little piece of land to build a factory. Sounds pretty harmless, right? Just a simple business request?
Yeah, well, that humble factory didn't stay humble for long. Before you knew it, it was a full-on military fort with a deep ditch around it and bristling with cannons. The game was changing from trade to conquest, and the local rulers were definitely starting to notice.
And the Nawab's list of complaints got serious. He accused the company of stealing his merchants, collecting taxes they had no right to, straight-up robbery and plundering, and even forcing his people into slavery. What started as a humble petition had turned into a direct challenge to his rule.
Now, if you need a poster child for this whole nabob phenomenon, look no further than Robert Clive. His life story is the story of the nabobs, but turned up to 11.
Here's the crucial moment. After a huge turning point, the Battle of Plassey, a whole new system was put in place. The British officials basically forced the local nawabs to give them enormous gifts of money and land. And this wasn't a salary or company profit. This was wealth from an Indian kingdom going directly into the private pockets of British men. And Clive's rise was just meteoric. He shows up in India in 1743 when he's just a teenager. By 1764, he's made governor of Bengal. And here's the kicker, his official job was to get rid of corruption. Can you believe it? 3 years later, he sails home with one of the biggest private fortunes in the world. How much are we talking about? Over 400,000 pounds. Now let that sink in. In the 18th century, that is an absolutely insane amount of money. Think tens, maybe even hundreds of millions in today's money. Just staggering.
And you've got to hear his defense when the British Parliament put him on trial for it. He basically stood up and said, "Gentlemen, I walked through treasure vaults piled high with gold and jewels. The city was at my mercy." He then says, "I'm astonished at my own moderation." He wasn't sorry for what he took. He was amazed he didn't take more. The nerve.
But Clive's story doesn't end there with him sailing off into the sunset, because for every nabob who struck it rich, there's a much more complicated and often much darker side to the story. You see, even though he was cleared of all charges in Parliament, the public shame and the constant pressure clearly took its toll. Just 2 years after he was acquitted, Robert Clive, the man who had conquered Bengal and amassed a colossal fortune, took his own life. All that wealth came at a terrible personal price.
And it's so important to remember, not every British guy in India was a Robert Clive. A lot of them came from pretty humble families, and their big dream was just to make enough money to go home and live a decent, comfortable life. For them, India was a huge gamble, and the hard reality is most of them lost. They never made it home, dying of disease or in one of the endless wars.
So what about the lucky few who did survive and did manage to bring a fortune back to Britain? You'd think they'd be the toast of the town, right? Well, not exactly. Well, let's just say they weren't subtle. These returned nabobs were all about flash. They bought up huge country estates, fancy London townhouses, and they threw their money around to buy political influence. They flaunted their wealth in a way that the established, old money aristocrats found totally tasteless. So yeah, they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. The high and mighty of British society saw them as crude, social climbing upstarts, new money. They became a national punchline, constantly getting made fun of in plays and cartoons. They had enough cash to buy their way into Parliament, but they could never buy real respect.
And that leaves us with a really big question. The story of the nabobs is one of incredible ambition and wealth, for sure, but it's also a story of exploitation, social chaos, and deep personal tragedy. It forces you to ask, what is the true legacy of a fortune that's been built on the back of an empire?
Have you ever heard a story that sounds almost too wild to be true? Well, this is one of them. It's the story of how a single private company, the British East India Company, managed to take over the entire Indian subcontinent.
I mean, seriously, think about that for a second. How does a company that's supposed to be trading spices and textiles end up ruling millions of people? Your first thought is probably, well, they must have had a massive army. And yeah, they did, eventually. But the real story, the way it all started, is so much more subtle and honestly way more cunning than just brute force. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the big picture strategy. Then we'll dive into the specific tactics, the imperial playbook they used. We'll meet a ruler who saw right through it, find out what happened when the playbook didn't work, and finally, we'll talk about how the people who win the war get to write the story.
All right, first up, a company's conquest. The thing you have to get about the East India Company's rise to power is that it wasn't some sudden invasion. It was a slow, calculated creep of influence. See, historians point out that the company hardly ever just rolled up and started a war. Nope. Instead, they used a whole toolbox of political, economic, and diplomatic tricks to get their hooks in first. It wasn't about one big knockout punch. It was more like a conquest by 1,000 paper cuts. So if they weren't just attacking, what were they doing? Well, that brings us to Section 2, the Imperial Playbook. These were their signature moves, the clever strategies they used over and over again to take control from the inside out.
Okay, so play number 1 was installing something called a company resident. Officially, this person was just an agent, a kind of ambassador. But their real job? Oh, it was to meddle, to whisper in the ruler's ear, to influence who the next heir would be. Basically, to make sure that the state's decisions always benefited the company. And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to this shockingly honest take from the philosopher James Mill back in 1832. He's not pulling any punches. He says the resident really is king of the country. And you hear that threat, right? As long as the local prince does what he's told, everything's fine. But the second he steps out of line, then comes clashing and disturbance. Chill.
And this painting just captures that dynamic perfectly. Look at the Indian ruler, Nawab Shujaudollah. He looks like the absolute picture of power, right? He's all decked out in his finest clothes, standing tall. But the guy next to him, the much more plainly dressed British resident, he's the one pulling the strings. It's the perfect image of indirect rule. Let the local guy keep the fancy title as long as we keep the real power.
Now, for the next play in the book, the Subsidiary Alliance. This one is a masterpiece of manipulation. The deal was this. Hey, local ruler, you don't need your army anymore. Get rid of it, and we'll protect you. Sounds great, right? Except for the fine print. The ruler had to pay for this protection. It was basically a protection rocket, forcing them to pay for the very army that was occupying their land.
So you can see how this was just a total trap, right? It was a debt cycle that was designed for the ruler to fail. First, they accept protection. Then the company bills them for it. The payments, of course, are ridiculously high, so the ruler can't pay. And when they default, the penalty is, you guessed it, they have to hand over a piece of their kingdom. It was a brilliant, bloodless way to expand their territory.
But what happens when a ruler sees this scam for what it is and decides to fight back? That brings us to our third section, in the incredible story of Tipu Sultan, the man they called the Tiger of Mysore.
This is Tipu Sultan, and he was different. He and his father had built their kingdom, Mysore, into a powerhouse that controlled the incredibly valuable spice trade. This was not a leader who was going to be easily bullied or tricked. He saw the company's playbook a mile away and was a direct threat to everything they wanted.
And he didn't just sit back. He fought back. He hit the company right where it hurt, their profits, by cutting off the export of precious goods. Then he told his local merchants they couldn't trade with the company either. And the real kicker? He became friends with Britain's arch nemesis, the French, and got their help to modernize his army. To the British, this was unacceptable. They saw him as dangerous, a problem that had to be eliminated.
And if you want a symbol of his defiance, look no further than this. This is incredible. It's a life-sized mechanical toy that Tipu Sultan owned. It shows a tiger mauling a European soldier. And when you turn the crank, the tiger would roar and the soldier would shriek. I mean, come on. This was not a subtle message. This was a man openly declaring his resistance to British power.
So when the sneaky playbook of residents and alliances smashed into a wall of resistance like Tipu Sultan, the mask had to come off. That's Section 4, when the plays fail. It was time for brute force.
4. That number says it all. The company had to fight 4 separate, brutal, and expensive wars against Mysore. This wasn't some small skirmish. Tipu and his father actually beat the British multiple times. This was an all-out struggle against a modern, powerful kingdom that refused to bow down.
But here's where we start to see how the story gets told. After one defeat, Tipu was forced to give up his 2 young sons as hostages. And what happens immediately? British painters start creating these grand paintings of the event. Why? Because as the sources tell us, they love to create scenes showing the triumph of British power. This isn't just art, it's propaganda. It's crafting the narrative of victory.
Ultimately, the sheer military might of the company was too much. In 1799, Tipu Sultan was killed fighting to defend his capital city. And what's the very first thing the British did after they won? They forced Mysore into that same subsidiary alliance that Tipu had spent his whole life resisting. The playbook was finally forced on them at the end of a sword.
And that brings us to our final and maybe most important section, winning the war, writing the history. Because after the last shot is fired, a new battle begins, the battle for the story itself.
And this is the key takeaway. When we look at things from this era, like that painting of Tipu's sons being taken hostage, we can't just see them as snapshots of history. They're not. They are carefully constructed narratives. They were made to tell a specific story, one of British superiority, of a justified conquest. The story they tell isn't just what happened. It's what the winners wanted us to believe happened.
The East India Company's playbook was, without a doubt, brutally effective. It used debt, diplomacy, and spies before it ever had to use its armies. It's a powerful lesson that history is filled with these kinds of strategies, where power and control are gained in ways you don't always see happening in plain sight. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the plays being run today? Thanks for watching.
You know, it's a pretty wild question when you think about it. How does a private company, a trading corporation, end up conquering an entire subcontinent? Well, it wasn't just with armies. It was with policies, with paperwork, and with an absolutely relentless drive. We're talking about the British East India Company completely redrawing the map of India in just 60 years. It wasn't one single event, but a very calculated decade-by-decade campaign. So let's break down exactly how they pulled it off.
Okay, take a look at this map. It's 1797. The yellow bits? That's the British. They're basically just clinging to the coasts. But that vast red area, that's a whole tapestry of powerful, independent Indian states. So the big question is, how did this picture change so completely and so fast? It really boils down to a three-pronged strategy. Good old-fashioned war, a new political ideology, and some very clever bureaucracy.
So, first things first. Before you can expand, you have to take out your main competition. And for the company, starting in the late 18th century, their #1 target was the Maratha Confederacy. These guys were a serious power, a massive alliance of states that had their own ambitions of ruling from Delhi.
Now, this wasn't just a single battle. It was a systematic, drawn-out campaign over decades. The first war, which wrapped up in 1782, was basically a draw. But the second one, from 1803 to 1805, that was a huge turning point. It gave the British control over critical territories, including both Agra and Delhi. And then, the final war, just over a decade later, was the absolute knockout blow.
And here's the bottom line. By 1819, Maratha power was completely shattered. Their leader, the Peshwa, was kicked out, sent into exile with a pension. And just like that, the biggest military hurdle to the company's dominance over a huge chunk of India was just gone.
So, with their main military rivals out of the picture, the company's ambitions just exploded. Under Governor-General Lord Hastings around 1813, they started shifting gears. They moved from just conquering land to pushing a new, really aggressive political idea to justify taking even more. They called it paramountcy. And the logic was, well, it was breathtakingly audacious. The company basically just declared that its authority was supreme, paramount. This meant its power was greater than any Indian states, and because of that, it could annex any kingdom it wanted, all under the excuse of protecting its interests. It was essentially a political blank check for takeover.
But you can't just declare you're the supreme boss and expect everyone to just nod along, right? This bold claim was met with some fierce resistance, and a small state in what we now call Karnataka became a really powerful symbol of that defiance.
And this is where we meet the incredible Rani Channamma, the Queen of Kittur. When the British came knocking, trying to annex her kingdom using this new policy, she didn't just negotiate. No way. She took up arms and led a resistance movement against them.
Now, Rani Channamma was eventually captured in 1824, and she tragically died in prison, but the fight didn't stop with her. A poor watchman, a chowkidar named Rana, picked up the torch. He rallied popular support, went around destroying British camps and records, before he too was caught and executed. Their story is so important because it shows that these company policies were met with real, incredible courage and sacrifice.
Okay, let's get to the third and final tool in the company's kit. And honestly, this one might be the most cunning of all. Under Lord Dalhousie, who took charge in 1848, the last big wave of annexations wasn't driven by armies or grand claims. It was driven by a simple but devastating bureaucratic rule.
It was called the Doctrine of Lapse, and from the company's perspective, it was administrative genius. The rule was simple. If any Indian ruler died without a natural-born male heir, their kingdom would just lapse. It would be absorbed directly into company territory. No need for a messy, expensive war. All it took was the stroke of a pen.
And boy, did they apply it. Relentlessly. Just look at this timeline. One kingdom after another just fell like dominoes. Satara in 48, Sambalpur in 50, Nagpur in 53, Jhansi in 54. The map was literally being redrawn year after year.
And when the doctrine didn't quite fit, well, they just found another reason. In 1856, they went after the very wealthy kingdom of Awadh. This time, the excuse wasn't a lack of an heir. Oh no, the British claimed they were obliged by duty to take over, to free the people from the supposed misgovernment of their own ruler. As you can imagine, that move made the local people furious.
So, let's step back. We've got warfare, paramountcy, and the doctrine of lapse. What was the combined effect of all three? Well, the visual evidence is just staggering. Let's look at the maps and see how this all played out.
So here we are again, 1797. Remember this? A few footholds on the coast. The vast majority of the subcontinent is run by Indian rulers.
Now, let's jump forward to 1840. Look at the difference. That yellow area has just exploded across the map. This is the direct result of the Maratha Wars and that policy of paramountcy, pushing British power right into the heart of India.
And now, for the final map, 1857. This is what happens when you layer the doctrine of lapse and the annexation of Awadh on top of everything else. The red, independent areas have shrunk to just a few isolated pockets. In 60 years, a trading company has become the undisputed master of a subcontinent. It's breathtaking.
So the conquest was pretty much complete. Through this combination of brute military force and ideology of supremacy and some really sharp bureaucratic tactics, the East India Company had done the unthinkable. But here's the thing. Winning territory is one thing. Actually ruling it, that's a whole different ballgame. And as the people of India watched their world get turned upside down, a huge question hung in the air. What was the price of this new reality going to be? Well, that price would start to be paid in the massive revolt that erupted that very same year, 1857.
So how does a company, a private trading company, set up just to make a profit, end up basically running an entire subcontinent? Well, it's a wild story of ambition, and it meant they had to build a new government, a new army, and a whole new way of thinking about power. We're going to break down how they pulled it off. Okay, so our story actually kicks off not in India, but right here in the fancy halls of the British Parliament in London. The year is 1789, and this image captures the incredible drama of the impeachment trial of Warren Hastings. He was the first Governor-General of Bengal, the guy who essentially built the company's empire, and now he was on trial for his life.
And this wasn't some quick trial, you know. It dragged on for an astonishing 7 years. For 7 years, the man who built an empire faced his accusers back home. It really makes you wonder, right? What on earth did he build over there, and why did it cause such a massive 7-year-long fight in London?
The main guy pointing the finger at Hastings was Edmund Burke, a pretty big deal in Parliament. And his accusation was serious. He charged Hastings with the misgovernment of Bengal. He even called him the common enemy and oppressor of all. Whoa. But, to really get why Burke was so furious, you have to understand what Hastings actually created in India.
So, to get to the bottom of this whole 7-year saga, we've got to hit rewind. We're going to leave London behind and travel back to India to see the system that Warren Hastings put into place. A system that would literally transform a trading company into an empire.
One of the first things Hastings did, and this was huge, was to completely rebuild the justice system. He knew the company couldn't just be about buying and selling anymore. Nope, they had to govern. So starting back in 1772, he began rolling out this brand new legal framework, district by district.
And the model, on the surface, was pretty straightforward. Every single district was going to have 2 courts. You got the criminal court, the Faujdari Adalat, and then you have the civil court, the Diwani Adalat. It was this 2-part system that was designed to handle, well, pretty much everything. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. You got these European district collectors in charge of the civil courts, but they still needed local experts, Malvis and Hindu Pandits, to actually interpret Indian law for them. And the criminal courts, they were still run by Indian legal experts, but, and this is a big but, they were now being supervised by those same European collectors. It was a whole new layer of control.
And hey, just so we're all on the same page with the terms, a qazi is basically the judge, and a mufti is the legal scholar who tells the judge what the law actually says. So this was the system that was already there, but now it had this new British supervision kind of sitting on top of it all.
And this right here is the absolute key. This whole setup created this new, incredibly powerful figure, the collector. I mean, this guy's job wasn't just about collecting revenue anymore. He was the law and order. And putting all that power into one company employee, pushing aside traditional Indian leaders, yeah, you can see why that would make guys like Edmund Burke back in London start to get really nervous. Of course, having new laws and new courts is one thing, but enforcing them, that's another. You need muscle. So if the new justice system was the software, now we're going to talk about the hardware, the military force that made it all stick.
And man, what a shift it was. Think about the old Mughal army. It was all about the prestige of its cavalry, these elite warriors on horseback, the Sawars. But the company, they went a totally different route. They built their power on foot soldiers. They started recruiting peasants and training them, really training them, to be professional soldiers armed with modern European muskets.
Now, don't get me wrong, the company still used cavalry, or sawars, but you can see the writing on the wall. As warfare changed and expanded into new places like Burma and Afghanistan, the guy on the horse just wasn't as critical anymore. The real game changer was disciplined infantry that could handle modern military tactics.
And what came out of this was something brand new in India, a single, uniform military culture. We're talking European-style training, constant drills, and strict discipline. Just stop and think about how radical that was. They were creating a standardized professional army that regulated every single aspect of a soldier's life.
But, and there's always a but, isn't there? This new professional army also created a massive internal conflict for the Indian soldiers, the sepoys, who filled its ranks. The system might have been efficient, but it was causing some serious problems on a personal level.
Which leads to this really fundamental question, Could these men just stop being who they were? Could they really set aside their deep-seated caste and religious identities and see themselves only as soldiers, completely separate from the communities they came from?
And the answer for a lot of them was a hard no. This new military culture just barreled right over their deepest held beliefs. And this clash, this tension between their professional duties and their personal identity, it just simmered and simmered until, decades later, it exploded into the Great Revolt of 1857. So let's recap. You've got a brand new system of justice and a powerful modern army to back it up. What happens when you put those two things together? Well, you get the complete transformation of the East India Company.
And the results were just mind-blowing. By 1857, the East India Company directly ruled over 63% of the entire Indian subcontinent. Just let that sink in. A company started for trade now controlled a vast territory.
And it gets even crazier when you look at the people. In that same year, the company ruled over 78% of the population. The vast majority of people in India were now living under the authority of a foreign commercial entity.
So what's the bottom line here? Through all these innovations, in the courts, in the army, the East India Company had fundamentally changed its DNA. It was no longer just a group of merchants asking for permission to do business. It had become a territorial colonial power, a de facto state. And that transformation is exactly what the case against Warren Hastings was all about. Which brings us full circle, right back to London and that 7-year trial. Because Edmund Burke didn't see progress, he saw tyranny. In his opening speech, he just lays it out. I impeach the common enemy and oppressor of all. Now, in the end, Warren Hastings was actually acquitted, but Burke's accusation, it still hangs in the air, It forces us to ask, what is the true cost of building an empire?